Jake Morrison stepped off the transport ship and looked around at the biggest university he had ever seen. The building stretched up into the purple sky of planet Kepler 442b, made of materials that seemed to glow with their own light. Students from dozens of different alien species walked along the pathways between the buildings. Some floated, some crawled, and some moved in ways Jake could not even describe. He carried only a small bag with his clothes and research papers. On his belt hung a simple leather sheath with his survival knife inside. The knife was nothing special. To look at, it had a 6-inch steel blade and a worn wooden handle. Jake had owned it for 15 years and used it for everything from cutting rope to preparing food during his field research on Earth. The Galactic University was famous across the galaxy. Every species that had reached space travel wanted to send their best minds here to learn and teach. Jake felt honored to be chosen for the human exchange program. Even though he knew many aliens thought humans were still primitive compared to other species. Dr. Lisa Chun walked beside him, looking just as amazed as Jake felt. She was a xenobiologist, someone who studied alien life forms. Lisa had been Jake's friend since their graduate school days on Earth. She was smart, curious, and always ready to learn something new. "Can you believe we're actually here?" Lisa said, watching a group of floating jellyfish creatures drift past them toward one of the science buildings. "It's incredible," Jake replied. "I just hope I can contribute something useful while we're here." They followed the signs toward the main administration building. Jake's research focused on how humans adapted simple tools to survive in difficult environments. He had studied how early humans lived in caves, how they made fire, and how they used basic tools to build shelters that lasted for thousands of years. Most aliens found this kind of research boring or pointless, but Jake believed there was still value in understanding simple solutions to complex problems. The orientation session was held in a huge auditorium that could hold thousands of beings. Jake and Lisa found seats near the middle and watched as the room filled with creatures unlike anything they had ever imagined. There were beings made of living crystal, others that looked like walking trees, and some that appeared to be made of pure energy contained in glowing suits. The university dean, a tall blue creature with 4 arms and eyes that could move independently, welcomed everyone to the new semester. She spoke in the universal language that all space-traveling species used, and translator devices helped everyone understand each other perfectly. After the main presentation, faculty members were invited to introduce themselves and their research. Jake felt nervous as his turn approached. He had practiced his presentation many times, but standing in front of so many advanced alien minds made him feel very small. "Dr. Jake Morrison from Earth," he began, his voice echoing through the auditorium. "I study primitive tool adaptation in extreme environments. My research focuses on how simple tools and basic techniques can solve complex survival problems." He held up his knife, still in its leather sheath. "This is an example of what I study, a basic cutting tool that humans have used for thousands of years. Despite its simplicity, it can perform hundreds of different functions that help humans survive in almost any environment." The moment Jake showed his knife, he heard sounds from the audience that he did not expect. Some aliens made clicking noises that sounded like laughter. Others produced low humming sounds that seemed to indicate disapproval or amusement. Near the front of the auditorium, a towering figure stood up. The being was 8 feet tall and appeared to be made of living crystal. Its body reflected light in patterns that changed as it moved, creating a display that was both beautiful and intimidating. This was Professor Zethkar, one of the most respected faculty members at the university. He belonged to the Vorthan Empire, a species known for their incredible technology and their belief that they were superior to all biological life forms. Professor Zethkar made a sound like wind chimes, being shaken violently, which Jake's translator indicated was laughter. The sound was not pleasant, and it made Jake's teeth ache. "Esteemed colleagues," Professor Zethkar said, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, "I must express my amusement at what we have just witnessed. This human believes that a primitive scraping implement holds scientific significance. The professor's crystalline body flashed with brighter light as he continued speaking. While the Vorthan Empire reshapes matter at the molecular level, while we build cities that float in space and machines that can think faster than biological brains, this human presents us with a sharpened piece of metal and calls it research. More aliens in the audience made sounds of agreement. Jake felt his face growing warm with embarrassment, but he forced himself to remain calm. Lisa reached over and squeezed his arm in support. Professor Zethkar was not finished. This primitive tool represents everything that holds biological species back from true advancement. Instead of embracing technology that can solve any problem, humans cling to methods that belong in their species' distant past. The professor gestured toward Jake with one of his crystalline arms. Perhaps Dr. Morrison would like to demonstrate how his little blade can compete with our molecular fabrication systems. I am certain the comparison would be most educational for our students. Several other faculty members joined in what seemed to be alien laughter. Professor Silthara, a serpentine creature with dozens of sensory tentacles, swayed in a way that Jake's translator indicated was agreement. Even Wisdom of Depths, a being that appeared to be a contained cloud of intelligent gas, pulsed with colors that suggested amusement. Jake stood quietly through the mockery, his hand resting unconsciously on his knife handle. He had faced doubt and criticism before, but never from beings whose technology was so far beyond anything humans had achieved. Part of him wanted to defend his research, to explain why simple tools still mattered, but he knew that any response would only invite more ridicule. Lisa stood up beside him, her face flushed with anger. Professor Zethkar, I think you might be surprised by what simple tools can accomplish in the right hands. The crystalline professor's laughter became even louder. Dr. Chun, I appreciate your loyalty to your colleague, but defending primitive technology will not make it advanced. The universe has moved beyond such crude implements. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the human dean of interspecies studies, stepped forward. She had been at the university for 3 years and had earned respect from many alien faculty members through her diplomatic skills and deep knowledge of xenocultural relations. I think, Dr. Rodriguez said carefully, that the purpose of academic exchange is to learn from different perspectives. Perhaps we should reserve judgment until we have seen what each approach can accomplish. Professor Zethkar's crystal body dimmed slightly, which indicated mild annoyance. Of course, Dean Rodriguez. I meant no disrespect to the exchange program. I simply find it fascinating that some species continue to rely on methods that more advanced civilizations abandoned long ago. The orientation session continued, but Jake found it difficult to concentrate on the remaining presentations. He could feel eyes on him from all directions, and not all of them seemed friendly. Some aliens appeared curious about the human who had been publicly mocked, while others seemed to agree with Professor Zethkar's assessment. When the session finally ended, Jake and Lisa walked out of the auditorium together. Neither spoke until they were well away from the other faculty members. Well, that was humiliating, Jake said, trying to keep his voice light. That professor was completely out of line, Lisa replied. There was no reason for him to be so rude. Jake shrugged. He's not wrong about human technology being primitive compared to what other species have achieved. Maybe I don't belong here. Don't say that, Lisa said firmly. You're here because your research has value. Just because some arrogant crystal being can't see it doesn't mean you should give up. Jake touched his knife again, a habit he had developed over the years. The simple tool had never let him down, no matter what situation he found himself in. Maybe Lisa was right. Maybe he did belong here, even if he had to prove it the hard way. 3 days passed since the embarrassing orientation session. Jake tried to focus on his work, but he could not escape the feeling that other faculty members were watching him and waiting for him to fail. He spent his time in the university library, reading about the different species and their technologies. The more he learned, the more impressed he became with what these alien civilizations had accomplished. Lisa was having better luck with her research. The alien biology department welcomed her with open arms, eager to learn about Earth's life forms and share their own discoveries. She spent her days in laboratories filled with specimens from hundreds of different worlds. On the third morning, Jake was eating breakfast in the faculty dining hall when he noticed a commotion near the communication center. Aliens were gathering around the main information display, their various forms of body language showing concern and worry. Jake walked over to see what was happening. The display showed a map of Kepler 442b with a red warning zone marked on the northern continent. Text scrolled across the screen in the universal language, and Jake read it with growing alarm. A survey team had gone missing. The team consisted of 12 researchers from different species who had been studying the planet's geological formations. They had been working in the northern continent for 2 weeks when a massive storm system moved in faster than anyone had predicted. The storm was unlike anything the planet had experienced in recorded history. Electromagnetic interference from the storm had knocked out all communication with the survey team. Their last message said their emergency shelter was failing and their equipment was not working properly. Jake felt his stomach tighten as he read more details. The survey team had been studying the same type of rock formations that Jake specialized in. They were geologists just like him. If they were in trouble, Jake understood exactly what kind of danger they faced. Professor Zethkar appeared at the information display, his crystalline form flashing with urgent light patterns. Several other faculty members gathered around him, including Professor Sothara and Wisdom of Depths. This situation requires immediate action, Professor Zethkar announced. I will lead a rescue mission using our most advanced molecular fabrication equipment. We can deploy automated construction drones that will build a complete research station in a matter of hours. The other aliens made sounds of approval. Jake had to admit that the plan sounded impressive. The Vorthan molecular fabrication technology could create almost anything from basic materials. The construction drones were legendary for their speed and precision. The storm system is causing electromagnetic interference, Professor Silthara pointed out, her serpentine body coiling with worry. Will your equipment function properly under those conditions? Professor Zethkar's crystal body brightened with confidence. Our technology is designed to adapt to any environmental conditions. These storms may interfere with primitive communication systems, but Vorthan engineering is far more sophisticated. Jake stepped forward before he could stop himself. Professor, I'd like to volunteer for the rescue mission. The crystalline being turned toward Jake, and the sound he made was clearly one of disbelief. Dr. Morrison, this is a serious emergency situation. We need solutions that work, not experiments with primitive tools. I understand the terrain they're working in, Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. I've studied similar rock formations. On Earth, I might be able to help. Professor Zethkar made that Wenchine laughing sound again. Your participation would only slow our technological solution. Perhaps you could use this time to sharpen your little blade while we save lives. Jake felt his face burning with embarrassment, but he did not back down. Those people are in danger. I want to help. The human makes a valid point, said a new voice. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had arrived at the information display and had been listening to the conversation. Professor Zethkar, the university's policy is to encourage collaborative learning between species. Dr. Morrison's expertise in geological formations could be valuable. The crystalline professor's light patterns shifted to show annoyance. Dean Rodriguez, I appreciate the university's commitment to cooperation, but this is a life-or-death situation. We cannot afford to waste time on primitive methods. I'm not asking you to waste time, Dr. Rodriguez replied calmly. I'm asking you to include Dr. Morrison as an observer. He won't interfere with your technological solutions, but he might learn something valuable about how advanced civilizations handle emergencies. Professor Zethkar was quiet for a long moment, his crystal body dim with thought. Finally he spoke. Very well. The human may accompany us as an observer only. He will not participate in the actual rescue operations. Jake nodded, grateful for any chance to help. Thank you, Professor. I won't get in the way. See that you don't, the crystalline being replied coldly. The rescue team was assembled quickly. Besides Professor Zethkar, It included 3 Vorthan technicians who specialized in operating the molecular fabrication equipment. Jake and Lisa were included as observers. Along with Professor Silthara and Wisdom Dash of Dash Depths. The equipment they loaded onto. The rescue ship was impressive beyond anything Jake had ever seen. The molecular fabrication units looked like large metal boxes, but Jake knew they contained technology that could rearrange matter at the atomic level. The construction drones were sleek flying machines that could work together to build structures with perfect precision. The ship itself was a marvel of engineering. It could travel between stars, but it was also designed for atmospheric flight. The hull was made of materials that could withstand extreme temperatures and pressure. The navigation systems could plot courses through space storms and planetary weather systems. As they prepared for takeoff, Jake checked his equipment. He had brought his geological survey tools, some basic camping gear, and of course his knife. Compared to the advanced technology surrounding him, his equipment looked like children's toys. Lisa sat beside him as the ship lifted off from the university's landing pad. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly. "That professor clearly doesn't want you here." "Those people are in trouble," Jake replied. "If there's any chance I can help, I have to try." The flight to the northern continent took 3 hours. Jake spent the time studying maps of the area and reading reports about the missing survey team. The geological formations they had been studying were similar to ones Jake had worked with on Earth, but the scale was much larger. The rock layers were thicker, and the formations were more complex. Professor Zethkar spent the flight time checking and rechecking his equipment. The molecular fabrication units ran diagnostic tests that filled the ship with humming sounds. The construction drones performed flight tests in the ship's cargo bay, moving with precise coordination. "The electromagnetic interference is stronger than we expected," one of the Vorthan technicians reported as they approached the northern continent. "Some of our sensors are showing anomalous readings." Professor Zethkar's crystal body flashed with annoyance. "Run a full diagnostic on all systems. Our technology should compensate for any environmental interference." Jake looked out the ship's window at the landscape below. The northern continent was a harsh place, with jagged mountains and deep valleys carved by ancient glaciers. The storm system they were flying toward looked like a wall of dark clouds that stretched from the ground to the upper atmosphere. Lightning flashed constantly within the storm clouds, creating electromagnetic pulses that Jake could feel in his teeth. The ship's instruments flickered as they flew closer to the storm zone. "Landing coordinates established," the pilot announced. "We'll set down 20 miles from the survey team's last known position." "The storm system is too dangerous to fly any closer." As the ship descended toward the planet's surface, Jake could see the terrain more clearly. The ground was covered with exposed rock formations that showed millions of years of geological history. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The ship touched down on a flat area between 2 large rock outcroppings. Through the windows, Jake could see the storm system moving toward them like a living thing. They had very little time to reach the survey team before the storm made any rescue attempt impossible. Professor Zethkar stood up and addressed the team. "We will proceed according to plan. The molecular fabrication units will be deployed first, followed by the construction drones. We will build a shelter that can withstand the storm and provide a base for reaching the survey team." Jake nodded, along with the others, but he was already studying the rock formations outside the ship. Something about the way the stone layers were arranged caught his attention. He had seen similar formations on Earth, and he knew they had specific properties that could be useful in exactly this kind of situation. As the rescue team prepared to leave the ship, Jake touched his knife handle one more time. He had a feeling he was going to need it. The rescue team stepped out of the ship and immediately felt the power of the approaching storm. The wind was already strong enough to make walking difficult, and the air crackled with electrical energy that made their hair stand up. Jake could taste metal in his mouth from all the electromagnetic activity in the atmosphere. Professor Zethkar began directing his technicians to unload the molecular fabrication equipment. The large metal boxes looked heavy, but the Vorthen technology made them easy to move. Anti-gravity generators built into each unit allowed them to float just above the ground. "Establish the fabrication perimeter here," Professor Zethkar commanded, his crystal body flashing with urgent light patterns. "Deploy the construction drones as soon as the molecular units are online." Jake watched as the aliens worked with impressive efficiency. The Vorthen technicians moved like they had practiced this operation hundreds of times. Within minutes, they had the fabrication units arranged in a circle and were beginning the startup sequence, but something was wrong. Jake noticed it before the aliens did. The fabrication units were making sounds they should not be making. Instead of the smooth humming that had filled the ship during their diagnostic tests, the machines were producing irregular clicking and buzzing noises. One of the Vorthen technicians looked up from his control panel with confusion. "Professor, we're getting error messages from the primary fabrication unit. The quantum processors are showing instability." Professor Zethkar moved quickly to examine the readings. His crystal body dimmed as he studied the data. "Run a full system diagnostic?" This equipment was functioning perfectly during our flight. Jake looked up at the storm clouds, which were now directly overhead. Lightning was flashing constantly, and each bolt sent waves of electromagnetic energy across the landscape. He had studied similar phenomena on Earth, and he knew that sensitive electronic equipment could be affected by this kind of interference. "The storm," Jake said quietly to Lisa. "It's interfering with their equipment." Lisa nodded, watching as more error messages appeared on the alien control panels. "Should we tell them?" Before Jake could answer, the first construction drone tried to launch. The sleek flying machine rose about 10 feet into the air, then began spinning wildly before crashing back to the ground. Pieces of its navigation system scattered across the rocky surface. "What happened?" Professor Zethkar demanded, his voice taking on harmonics that Jake's translator indicated were panic. The Vorthen technician, who had been controlling the drone, looked bewildered. "Unknown, Professor. All systems showed normal operation, then complete navigation failure." A second drone was launched with the same result. This one managed to stay in the air for almost 30 seconds before its control systems failed and it crashed into a nearby rock formation. Professor Zethkar's crystal body was now flashing rapidly with agitated energy patterns. Jake had never seen a Vorthen display this level of distress before. "This is unprecedented. Our equipment is designed to function in any environment." The molecular fabrication units were having even worse problems. The quantum processors that controlled their matter manipulation systems were being overwhelmed by the electromagnetic interference from the storm. Error messages flashed across their displays faster than the technicians could read them. "Professor," one of the technicians reported, "the fabrication matrix is completely unstable. We cannot maintain molecular coherence in this electromagnetic environment." Jake watched as the most advanced technology in the galaxy failed piece by piece. The storm system was unlike anything the alien equipment had been designed to handle. The electromagnetic interference was so intense that it was disrupting the basic quantum processes that made their technology work. "Professor." Sulthara slithered over to where Jake and Lisa were standing. Her serpentine body was coiled with worry, and her sensory tentacles were twitching nervously. "This is very bad," she said. "Without the fabrication equipment, we have no way to build shelter or reach the survey team." Wisdom of depths, the gas cloud entity, pulsed with colors that indicated deep concern. "The storm system is intensifying. We have perhaps 2 hours before conditions become impossible for any rescue attempt." Jake looked around at the landscape with new eyes. The aliens had been so focused on their technology that they had not really examined the environment they were working in. But Jake saw possibilities that their advanced minds had missed. The rock formations around their landing site were perfect for what Jake had in mind. The stone was sedimentary, laid down in layers over millions of years. Jake could see natural fracture lines in the rock that indicated where it would break cleanly with the right pressure applied in the right places. There was a cliff face about 50 yards from where they had landed. The rock layers were clearly visible, and Jake could see that the stone was soft enough to work with basic tools, but hard enough to provide solid structural support. Jake started walking toward the cliff face, leaving the aliens to struggle with their failing equipment. Lisa noticed him moving away from the group and followed. "What are you thinking?" Lisa asked as they approached the rock wall. Jake pulled out his knife and tested the stone with a small scratch. The blade bit into the rock easily, confirming what he had suspected. "This is sandstone with limestone layers," he said. "It's perfect for carving." "Carving?" Lisa looked confused. "Jake, we need to build shelter for 14 people and somehow reach that survey team. We don't have time for geology experiments." Jake made another test cut, this one along what looked like a natural fracture line. A small piece of stone broke away cleanly, revealing the softer layer underneath. "Lisa, what if I told you I could carve a shelter out of this cliff that would be stronger than anything their machines could build?" Lisa stared at him. "I'd say you were crazy." "That's solid rock, Jake. You'd need heavy machinery to make any real progress." "Would I?" Jake asked, running his fingers along the rock face. He could feel the natural stress patterns in the stone, the places where thousands of years of pressure had created weak points that could be exploited. Back at the landing site, Professor Zethkar was becoming increasingly desperate. The storm was getting closer, and none of his equipment was functioning properly. The electromagnetic interference was so severe that even basic communication devices were failing. "Professor," one of his technicians called out, "the backup fabrication unit is also showing quantum processor failure. We have no functional equipment remaining." The crystalline being's body was now flickering with patterns that Jake recognized as fear. For all their advanced technology, the Vorthans had never learned to solve problems without their machines. When their equipment failed, they had no backup plan. "This is impossible," Professor Zethkar muttered, his voice carrying harmonics of confusion and panic. "Our technology should compensate for these conditions. The equipment specifications clearly state that it can function in electromagnetic environments up to Class 7 intensity." "What class is this storm?" Lisa asked. One of the Vorthan technicians checked his instruments before they failed completely. "Class 12 and still intensifying." Jake overheard this conversation as he continued examining the rock face. He had found what he was looking for. A natural cave entrance that had been partially filled with loose stone over the centuries. With the right technique, he could clear the entrance and expand the cave system into a full shelter. "Professor," Zethkar noticed Jake's activity and approached with obvious irritation. His crystal body was still flashing with agitated patterns, and his voice carried the sharp harmonics of stress. "Human Morrison," the professor said, "this is neither the time nor place for your primitive geological studies. We have real problems to solve, and lives are at stake." Jake did not stop his examination of the rock face. "I know lives are at stake, Professor. That's exactly why I'm doing this." "Doing what?" Professor Zethkar demanded. "Making scratches in stone while our equipment fails. Your little blade cannot solve problems that our molecular fabricators cannot handle." Jake turned to face the towering crystalline being. For the first time since arriving at the university, he felt completely confident in his abilities. "Professor, you need shelter for 14 people that can withstand winds over 200 miles per hour and temperatures below freezing. Your machines can't function in this electromagnetic environment, but this rock can provide everything we need." Professor Zethkar made that wind chime laughing sound, but it was strained and desperate now. "You believe that primitive tool can accomplish what our most advanced technology cannot? You are delusional, human." Jake pulled his knife from its sheath and held it up for everyone to see. The simple steel blade looked tiny and insignificant compared to the massive alien technology scattered around the landing site. But Jake knew something the aliens did not understand. "Sometimes," Jake said quietly, "the most advanced solution is the one that never fails." With that, he turned back to the rock face and began to work. Jake positioned himself at the cliff face and began working with his knife. His movements were careful and deliberate, nothing like the desperate scratching that the aliens expected to see. He had studied rock formations like this for years, and he knew exactly where to apply pressure to achieve maximum results. The first cuts were small and precise. Jake followed the natural fracture lines in the stone, places where water and time had already begun the work of breaking down the rock. His knife blade found these weak points and exploited them, creating controlled breaks that removed large sections of stone with minimal effort. Professor Zethkar watched from a distance, his crystal body dim with frustration. The alien professor was still trying to repair his equipment, but every system continued to fail as the electromagnetic storm grew stronger overhead. "Human Morrison," Professor Zethkar called out after watching Jake work for several minutes. "You're wasting precious time. We need real solutions, not primitive demonstrations." Jake did not stop working or turn around to respond. Instead, he continued his methodical cutting, following patterns that only he could see in the rock. Each strike of his knife was purposeful, designed to weaken the stone structure in exactly the right way. Lisa stood nearby, watching Jake work with growing amazement. She had seen him use his knife for small tasks during their research trips on Earth, but she had never seen him tackle anything this ambitious. "Jake, are you sure about this?" "Trust me," Jake replied, not pausing in his work. "This stone wants to break in certain directions. I'm just helping it along." The knife moved like an extension of Jake's body. He struck along natural weakness, points in the rock, creating hairline fractures that connected to form larger breaks. What appeared to be random scratching to the aliens was actually a sophisticated understanding of geological stress patterns and structural engineering. After an hour of work, Jake had created a narrow entrance into the cliff face. The opening was just wide enough for a person to enter, but Jake could see the potential for much more. Behind the entrance was a natural chamber that could be expanded and connected to other spaces. Professor Silthara slithered closer to examine Jake's progress. Her sensory tentacles explored the carved entrance, detecting the precision of the cuts and the structural integrity of the remaining stone. "This is remarkable," she admitted, her serpentine body coiling with surprise. "The human has created clean, straight cuts in solid rock using only that small blade." Professor Zethkar made a dismissive sound. "A small hole in the rock will not shelter 14 people from a storm that can destroy our equipment." Jake wiped sweat from his forehead and looked back at the alien professor. "This is just the beginning. Give me 4 more hours and I'll have a complete shelter system." 4 hours? Professor Zethkar's crystal body flashed with disbelief. "Our molecular fabricators were designed to complete a full research station in 6 hours, and they require massive amounts of power and advanced materials. Different tools, different methods," Jake said simply, turning back to his work. As Jake continued carving, his progress became undeniable. He worked his way deeper into the cliff face, following natural cave systems that he expanded and connected. His knife found every weak point in the stone, every place where the rock layers separated cleanly. The storm was getting closer, and the wind was now strong enough to make standing difficult. The aliens huddled near their useless equipment, watching Jake work with a mixture of skepticism and growing hope. Jake carved with remarkable speed and efficiency. He understood that sedimentary rock was formed in layers over millions of years, and these layers had different hardness and composition. By cutting along the boundaries between layers, he could remove large sections of stone with relatively little effort. He also understood structural engineering in ways that surprised even himself. As he carved deeper into the cliff, he left support pillars and arches that would distribute weight and resist the pressure of the storm winds. Every cut served multiple purposes: removing material, creating ventilation, and strengthening the overall structure. 2 hours into his work, Jake had carved a tunnel system that led to 3 separate chambers. The largest chamber was big enough to hold all 14 members of the rescue and survey teams. The smaller chambers could be used for storage and as sleeping areas. Wisdom of depths floated closer to examine the carved spaces. The gas cloud entity pulsed with colors that indicated amazement. "The human has created a complex architectural structure using only manual tools. The precision is extraordinary." Jake was now working on ventilation shafts that would allow air to circulate through the shelter system. He carved these shafts at angles that would prevent wind and rain from entering while still allowing fresh air to flow through the chambers. Professor Zethkar could no longer ignore what Jake was accomplishing. The crystalline being approached the shelter entrance and examined the carved walls with sensors built into his alien body. The structural integrity is sound, he admitted reluctantly. The human has somehow calculated load-bearing requirements and stress distribution without using any computational equipment. It's not calculation, Jake said, pausing in his work to explain. It's understanding how stone behaves. These rocks have been under pressure for millions of years. They want to break in certain directions, and they want to hold together in others. I'm just working with their natural properties instead of fighting against them. Professor Zethkar's crystal body flickered with confusion. You speak of the stone as if it were alive. Jake smiled and ran his hand along the carved wall. In a way it is. Every rock formation tells a story about pressure, time, and change. If you understand the story, you can predict how the rock will behave. By the third hour, Jake had created something that amazed even himself. The shelter system now included 5 connected chambers, multiple ventilation shafts, drainage channels, to handle water runoff and sleeping alcoves carved into the walls. The entire structure was designed to withstand extreme weather while providing comfort for its occupants. The aliens began moving their salvageable equipment into the shelter as the storm finally arrived in full force. Wind speeds reached over 200 miles per hour, and the temperature dropped below freezing. Rain fell in sheets so thick that visibility was reduced to just a few feet inside Jake's carved shelter. The rescue team was completely protected from the storm. The thick rock walls blocked the wind and cold, while the ventilation system provided fresh air without allowing the storm to enter. The drainage channels carried away any water that managed to seep through cracks in the stone. Lisa sat in the main chamber, watching the storm rage outside through the carefully positioned entrance. Jake, this is incredible. I can barely hear the wind from in here. Jake was still working, adding finishing touches to the sleeping alcoves and storage areas. His knife had never been sharper or more precise. Hours of cutting stone had honed the blade to a perfect edge, and his technique had become almost instinctive. Professor Zethkar stood in the center of the main chamber, his crystal body reflecting the light from the aliens' portable illumination devices. For the first time since Jake had met him, the arrogant professor seemed at a loss for words. This shelter, Professor Zethkar said slowly, provides better protection than our emergency structures. And you created it using nothing but a primitive cutting tool and manual labor. Jake sheathed his knife and looked around at his work. The shelter was not just functional, it was elegant. The carved walls followed the natural contours of the rock, creating spaces that felt organic and comfortable rather than artificial and sterile. It's not primitive, Jake said quietly. It's simple. There's a difference. The storm raged for 3 days, but the rescue team remained safe and comfortable in Jake's carved shelter. When the weather finally cleared, they used the shelter as a base of operations to reach the stranded survey team, who had survived in a much smaller cave system. They had found nearby Dot as they prepared to leave the shelter and return to the university. Professor Zethkar took one last look at the carved chambers. Human Morrison, I believe I owe you an apology. The storm finally ended on the 3rd day, leaving behind a world that looked completely different. The electromagnetic interference faded away, and the rescue team's communication equipment slowly began working again. Jake stood at the entrance of his carved shelter, looking out at the clear purple sky of Kepler-442b. The shelter had performed perfectly throughout the storm. Not a single drop of water had leaked through the walls, and the temperature inside had remained comfortable even when the outside air dropped far below freezing. The ventilation system had worked so well that the air inside felt fresh and clean. Professor Zethkar emerged from the main chamber and stood beside Jake. The crystalline being's body was no longer flashing with agitated patterns. Instead, his crystal form showed the steady, thoughtful glow that indicated deep contemplation. The survey team is responding to our signals, Professor Zethkar said. They survived the storm in a small cave system about 5 miles from here. They report no serious injuries, but their equipment is completely destroyed. Jake nodded, relieved that the missing researchers were safe. How long will it take to reach them? With your shelter as our base of operations, we can reach them easily. The terrain between here and their location is difficult but manageable. Now that the storm has passed, the rescue operation went smoothly. Using Jake's shelter as a staging area, the team was able to organize their supplies and plan their approach to the survey team's location. The carved chambers provided secure storage for equipment and a comfortable place for team members to rest between trips. When they finally reached the stranded survey team, Jake was surprised to see that the missing researchers had also been trying to carve shelters in the rock. However, their attempts had been much less successful. Without proper tools or knowledge of stoneworking techniques, they had only managed to create small, crude spaces that provided minimal protection. Dr. Amanda Foster, the leader of the survey team, was especially impressed when she saw Jake's shelter. She was a human geologist who had been studying similar rock formations on other worlds for over 20 years. "This is extraordinary work," Dr. Foster said as she examined the carved walls and ceiling supports. "I've seen ancient human cave dwellings that weren't constructed this well. How did you achieve this level of precision with hand tools?" Jake showed her his knife and explained his techniques. "It's all about understanding how the rock wants to break. These sedimentary layers have natural stress patterns that you can follow if you know what to look for." Dr. Foster ran her hands along the smooth carved surfaces. "I've been working with stone for decades, but I've never seen anything like this. You've created architectural features that most people would need power tools to achieve." The return journey to the university took 2 days. The entire rescue team, now including the 12 members of the survey party, stayed in Jake's shelter each night. The carved chambers easily accommodated all 26 people. With room to spare, during the evenings, Jake found himself answering questions about his stoneworking techniques. Aliens who had barely acknowledged his existence before the rescue mission now gathered around him, eager to learn about human problem-solving methods. Professor Silthara was particularly curious about how Jake had calculated the structural requirements for the shelter. "Your species does not appear to have natural mathematical abilities superior to ours," she observed. "Yet you created a structure that our engineering software would require extensive computational modeling to design." "I didn't calculate anything," Jake explained. "I observed how the rock was formed and worked with its natural properties. The stone itself tells you where it's strong and where it's weak." Wisdom of depths pulsed with colors that indicated fascination. "You suggest that effective engineering can be achieved through intuitive understanding rather than mathematical precision." "Sometimes," Jake said. "When you're working with natural materials, understanding their history and behavior can be more valuable than knowing their exact specifications." Professor Zethkar had been listening to these conversations with growing interest. The crystalline being had been unusually quiet since the storm ended, spending most of his time examining Jake's work and running tests on the carved stone. On their final night before reaching the university, Professor Zethkar approached Jake for a private conversation. They walked a short distance from the shelter, stopping at a place where they could see the stars through Kepler 442b's thin atmosphere. "Human Morrison," Professor Zethkar began, his voice carrying none of its previous arrogance, "I must acknowledge that my initial assessment of your capabilities was incorrect." Jake looked up at the alien professor, surprised by the admission. "Thank you for saying that, Professor. Your achievement with primitive tools exceeded our advanced technologies' performance in every measurable way," Professor Zethkar continued. "Your shelter provided better protection, required no external power source, and was completed faster than our automated systems could have managed even under ideal conditions." The crystalline being's body dimmed with what Jake was beginning to recognize as embarrassment. "I have spent centuries believing that technological advancement was the only measure of intelligence. Your demonstration has forced me to reconsider this assumption." Jake chose his words carefully. Every tool has its place, Professor. Your technology is remarkable and can accomplish things my knife never could. But sometimes the simplest solution is the most reliable one? Professor Zethkar was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried harmonics that Jake's translator indicated were respect and humility. Would you be willing to conduct a seminar on human tool adaptation techniques? I believe our students could benefit greatly from understanding alternative approaches to problem solving, Jake smiled. I'd be honored to, Professor. When they returned to the Galactic University, news of Jake's achievement had already spread throughout the academic community. The rescue mission had been monitored by university officials, and reports of the human who had carved a shelter from solid rock using only a knife had captured everyone's imagination. Jake found himself suddenly popular in ways he had never expected. Faculty members from dozens of different species approached him with questions about human engineering techniques and problem-solving methods. Students began requesting permission to attend his classes, even though he was supposedly just a visiting. RESEARCHER Dr. Elena Rodriguez offered Jake a permanent position as a professor of comparative engineering approaches. The university needs someone who can teach our students that there are many different ways to solve problems, she explained. Your perspective on working with natural materials and simple tools fills a gap in our curriculum that we didn't even know existed. Jake's first seminar was held in the same auditorium where he had been mocked just 2 weeks earlier. This time, the room was packed with aliens eager to learn about human ingenuity and adaptability. Professor Zethkar sat in the front row, his crystal body glowing with respectful attention. Jake began his presentation by holding up the same knife that had once been the subject of ridicule. This tool is over 15 years old, he said. It has helped me survive in deserts, mountains, forests, and now on an alien world. It has never failed me because it doesn't depend on power sources, computer systems, or complex mechanisms. He looked around the auditorium at hundreds of alien faces, each representing a different species and a different approach to understanding the universe. Intelligence comes in many forms, Jake continued. Sometimes the most advanced solution is the one that never breaks down. Lisa sat in the audience, watching her friend command the attention and respect of some of the galaxy's most brilliant minds. She thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From Jake's humiliation at orientation to his triumph during the rescue mission, Professor Zethkar raised one of his crystalline arms to ask a question. Dr. Morrison, how can we incorporate your approach to problem solving into our technological development processes? Jake smiled. Start by asking not what your machines can do, but what they might not be able to do. Then think about simple alternatives that could work when complex systems fail. After the seminar, Jake's knife was placed in the university's Museum of Significant Scientific Instruments. The display case included a holographic recording of the shelter Jake had carved, along with a plaque that read, "Sometimes the most advanced tool is the one that never fails." Jake kept a photograph of the display on his desk in his new office. Whenever students asked him about the secret to human adaptability, he would point to the picture and say, "The secret is understanding that every problem has a simple solution. If you're willing to work with what you have instead of wishing for what you don't." The alien professor who had once laughed at a human's tiny knife had become one of Jake's most dedicated students, learning that wisdom and intelligence could not be measured by the complexity of one's tools.